Hello and welcome to the academyofworship.org YouTube channel. My name's Chris. Today we're going to be adding something to your toolbox to use to flavor your major chords. It's a fairly simple concept, but it's going to take a little bit of digging to understand why you're doing what you're doing and why it sounds the way it sounds. In the intro music, you heard me play some first position chords like a G, a D, and maybe a C add 9 chord. Really basic chords that we kind of learn first on guitar. After I played each chord, I played the corresponding color chord. So what are these color chords that I was adding? They're normal major chords, but instead of the root note being the name of the chord, for instance a G for a G major or a D for a D major, we're putting the third of each of those chords in the root. So it's the first thing you hear, it's really prominent and kind of pokes out and has a different flavor to it. Now technically these are called inversions of chords, and that's where you take either the third or the fifth in the triad and you put it in the root as opposed to the root note. In this particular video, we're going to be putting the third in the root. So where do we start to figure out these chords and an easy way to move them around the neck? Well, we're going to be using what's called the caged system, which is essentially a way to look at every chord shape you can play as either a C shape, an A shape, a G shape, or an E shape. And while I'm not going to get into the caged system in this particular video, we are going to take the A out of caged and apply it here. So what's an A shape chord? Well, if you're used to playing an A major chord, it looks like this. That's where you bar across the second fret or use 3 fingers and play the middle 4 strings of your guitar. That shape moves around the neck when you use bar chords. So for instance, if I'm using a D shape for a bar chord like this, that's me playing the D on the A string on the 5th fret and barring the D, the G, and the B strings across the 7th fret and playing those 4 middle strings. If I remove my first finger here and just leave my finger here, you can see how we're barring across the same strings we were on the A. And therefore, this shape right here is an A shape because your first finger here on this fret, on the 5th fret, is essentially what your nut is doing right here for an open A string. So if you play this chord, and you can imagine it like this, you're doing the same thing. But since we don't have to actually fret the open A, that's why it looks the way it looks. So this chord is movable anywhere. So an E chord would be up here on the 7th fret on the A string. You can play a C down on the 3rd fret, A string. And everything we're doing today is based off of that shape, specifically the part you're barring. So if on, for example, the D chord, we remove the root note on the 5th fret, we're left with this. Because we're not adding this finger here. Now, if we replace our ring finger with our first finger, that's a pretty basic D triad right there, just a basic D chord. We're moving our ring finger on those chords into what our first finger was doing on the root note. And since we're using our first finger to bar where our ring finger was, it frees up our ring finger to now play a root note. In this case, it's going to be the 3rd. So if you use your first finger, like we're talking about, to bar here, the rest of that chord that you normally would have been barring with your ring finger plays 4 frets up from its original position in that D bar chord and ends up here, which essentially looks like a reverse version of that chord if you can think about it that way. So instead of playing this note here for our D chord, we're now playing this note, which in the key of D, or at least in the D major scale, that's the 3rd. And now we're left with something that sounds like this, instead of this. So when we play a D chord, or a D chord, we can replace the root note of D with the 3rd of a D major scale, which is an F sharp, here. And you get that beautiful D with a 3rd in the root. Now that shape is movable to anywhere you want. As long as you know where the bar part of whatever major chord you're using is, you can replace that bottom note of a 3rd. So for instance, if we're using an A major chord as our example, you have this. And if you want, you can play it low like this. We already have our bar here, so we're just adding this note underneath it. And you can move that up an octave. So if you know how to play an A major up here on the 12th fret of the A string, bring your whole hand up and let your first finger bar where your ring finger was barring, and then bring your ring finger down on this C sharp right here, which will be the third of an A major chord. So A major, move everything up and let your first finger bar, and put your ring finger down. You can see how this might be particularly useful to add some color to the chords if, say, the band is doing something else or someone's already holding down that really basic chord. So if you have an acoustic guitar player or a keyboard player kind of down low, holding down that really basic, say, D major chord, you can just invert it and play the third and the root. Now, one kind of country, maybe bluesy thing you can add to it that kind of adds a little bit of movement is to hammer on up to that note you're playing with your ring finger. So in the example of our D major chord, instead of just barring the D, G, and B strings, you bring your whole finger up to bar the A string as well. So you're barring everything on the middle 4 strings on the 7th fret, and you hammer on to the 9th in the case of the D, so that you get this sound. And if you practice it enough, you can kind of use it as a movement in the actual chord, like this. Now, obviously, you're not going to be able to use this every single time you play a major chord, but there are great times in music where maybe you're ending a phrase or you want to call attention to a certain chord, and this is a great substitution to put the third and the root. So go try it out. See how it sounds. Play it where you play a normal major chord and see what works, what doesn't. Use your ears. But it's a good piece of knowledge to add to that tool bag you have to add some color to things that may otherwise be pretty bland. That's it. I hope you learned something. Please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us out. Share the video where you think people might benefit from this sort of knowledge. And please comment below if you use inversions and put the third and the root already. How you use them, what songs you like to use them in. That'd be awesome to hear about. But until next time, go turn some knobs, flip some switches, and I'll see you in the next one. Have a good one.